Nigerian observers, the Nigerian media, local opinion polls, and international observers. This time, it was different. Following the deeply flawed 2007 elections, President Umaru Yar'Adua convened the UISA panel to recommend electoral reforms. After President Yar'Adua's unfortunate death last year, his successor, President Goodluck Jonathan, promised better elections in 2011. He appointed our keynote speaker, Professor Attitahiru Jega, as chairman of INEC in June 2010. Under severe time and some resource constraints, Chairman Jega promised elections that were free, fair, and credible. He also warned that elections would not be perfect in 2011. He delivered on both statements. In April 2011, millions of Nigerians went to the polls for a unique experience: participation in an election. They convened in the morning, found their name on an electoral register, voted in the afternoon, and saw the results of their vote reflected shortly thereafter. Often, they witnessed the count, something that I was able to see in person in Nsukka. The integrity of the process was strengthened by active and innovative participation from civil society. Thousands of observers deployed to polling stations. A parallel vote count was organized through Project Swift Count 2011, which we'll hear more about later this afternoon. And several IT and web platforms enabled citizens to text or Twitter results to central observer offices. The collaboration between INEC and civic groups was another notable contrast to earlier elections. However, elections were not perfect. To be sure, the polling was marked by late starts, organizational confusion, some local irregularities, and occasional misconduct. However, the earlier spectacle of wholesale fraud that was noted by Nigerians and other observers in past elections was not evident in this round. With national participation measured at 52%, President Jonathan registered a 59% margin against his leading challenger, General Muhammadu Buhari, with 32%. The overwhelming consensus was that the conduct and outcome of the polls were credible. This was likely the freest election in Nigerian history. More than 50 parties participated, and about 10 have earned political office. The ruling PDP emerged with a much diminished majority in national politics. And it should be remembered for those of us who were party to or witnessed the June 12th, 1993 elections, that those have set a standard in the popular imagination and in the memory of many Nigerians as the most credible election in the nation's history. And yet those elections were held under military auspices with only 2 legal political parties allowed to participate. And so the freeness and the competitiveness of this election should be noted. In the wake of the elections, however, problems have been evident. Some candidates, notably General Buhari, have charged widespread fraud and are seeking judicial review of the elections through the established tribunal process. These objections have also incited violence, especially in the northern states, that has claimed hundreds of lives. And the political violence that followed the election certainly represents a challenge to the national political leadership, both incumbents and competitors, to rein in their supporters and to establish a sense of civility and a sense of social peace. In addition to the immediate problems of political stability, there is a longer-term question, of course, of how to consolidate the achievements of electoral reform, improve future polls, and regularize the administration of orderly and transparent elections. Our lead speaker, Professor Attahiro Jega, is uniquely qualified to address these issues. A political science professor at Bayero University, Ghana, Professor Jega was educated at Ahmadu Bello University, BUK, and Northwestern University, where he earned his PhD in 1984. He has served as department chair in the political science department and national president of the Academic Staff Union of Universities, ASU, in Nigeria during the 1990s, where he championed collective rights and challenged military rulers. He served as Vice Chancellor of BUK from 2005 to 2010, moving from there into the chairmanship of INEC. He is also a founding member of CEDARD and served as a member of the UWICE Electoral Reform Panel in 2007-2008. He'll speak to us today on the April 2011 elections in Nigeria, accomplishments and challenges. And without any further delay, we would like to welcome Chairman Jega, and the podium is yours.
Professor Peter Lewis, the chairman of this occasion, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I want to place on record my appreciation to Professor Lewis and the Center for Advanced International Studies for giving me this opportunity, together with the collaborating partners, for today's event. Let me recognize in the audience my old teacher, Professor John Hayden, who in many ways that I can easily describe expanded my intellectual horizon at Northwestern University and gave me the opportunity to study political science and to become a student of Nigerian politics. So I want to thank you most sincerely for that. The topic of my presentation is April 2011 elections in Nigeria, accomplishments and challenges. You will notice that I put accomplishments with a question mark and an exclamation mark, and challenges with triple exclamation marks. So basically what I intend to do now is to, first of all, give a very brief background to my involvement with the Independent National Electoral Commission and the work of our new commission, and then discuss what we tried to do in the last 8 months or so in terms of preparing and conducting first the voter registration exercise and the 2011 April elections before discussing the accomplishments and the challenges. By way of background, I want to say that the new INEC was inaugurated on June 30th, 2011, following what I consider to be a national consensus on the need for free, fair, and credible elections in Nigeria. Obviously, as many scholars of Nigerian politics have observed, Nigerians have continuously struggled for democracy and they have continuously been disappointed. And transition to civil rule, which commenced in 1999, opened opportunities, but increasingly there evolved a crisis of rising expectations, particularly after the 2007 elections, which were many observers observed, very fraudulent, and which dashed many hopes in terms of consolidation of democracy in our country. After the 2007 elections, even the winner of that election, the late Professor Attahiru, recognized the need for electoral reforms and created the Mohammed Uwais panel to make recommendations for electoral reform. So the new Independent National Electoral Commission was inaugurated, I believe, amidst great expectations for getting things right this time around, given that national consensus for free, fair, and credible elections. After our inauguration, INEC received overwhelming support and encouragement from a wide range of stakeholders, both domestically and internationally. And we commenced work with commitment to obey the rules, to be impartial, to be non-partisan, to create a level playing field for all political parties and contestants, and to have openness and accessibility in the way in which we do our work as a commission. By the then existing legal framework, we were to conduct the elections in January, and initially, as a commission, we tried to do our best to operate within that existing legal framework with an extremely tight time frame. But it soon became necessary for amendments to both the Electoral Act and the Constitution to allow a more realistic time frame for the conduct of the election. And there were subsequent amendments to both the Constitution and the Electoral Act, which allowed elections to hold in April and which enabled our commission to compile a new voters register from January 16th to February 8th. I want to say a little bit about the compilation of that voters register, because as a new commission, we tried to study what was on the ground and came to the realization that it was absolutely necessary to create or compile a new voters register given the poor state of the one that we inherited. We believe that a credible voters register was a necessary requirement for credible elections, and we therefore took the decision to do a new voters register, of course, committing significant expenditure of time, energy, and resources in the production of such a register. We opted for biometric data capture using laptop-based direct capture machines. And given the time constraints, we adopted a methodology which involved the procurement and deployment of direct capture machines for each of the 120,000 polling units throughout the country, plus 10% redundancies. It also involved the recruitment and training and deployment of over 400,000 ad hoc staff, mostly National Youth Service Corps members and students of tertiary institutions. And we also established about 9,000 registration area centers, which became the field and administrative centers for services such as recharging the DDC machines at the end of each working day during the registration, as well as the aggregation of data that had been brought in from the field after daily registration exercise. In approximately 3 weeks, and in spite of formidable challenges, we were able to register about 73 million eligible voters. We've been able to establish a huge national asset of databases in each of the states and the federal capitals, 36 states and the federal capital territory, Abuja, and also a national database with equally secure disaster recovery centers, which were spread across the country. The customized registration software which we used for the voter registration was developed in-house, and we used the advanced fingerprint identification system software, which enabled us to detect and to eliminate multiple registration. And also in the process of organizing this and compiling this voters register, we were also able to verify the number of existing polling units in the country. And we established that it was just 26 less than 120,000 that everybody was talking about. But at least we were able to identify this, and in fact over 80% of them we had GIS coordinates for them, and we put that information also on our website. Having done what we consider to be a credible voter registration exercise, by no means perfect, but credible enough, and certainly what we consider to be a very good foundation of them conducting elections, then we proceeded with the business of making adequate preparations for the elections. First and foremost, we tried to factor in all the lessons that we've learned from the past in the preparation and the conduct of the April elections. And there are indeed many lessons that we've learned in that process. I, in particular, was privileged to serve on the Justice Mohammed Uwais panel, which interacted with ranges of stakeholders in Nigeria and compiled a lot of data and information on previous and past elections in Nigeria, and also went around the country and interacted in virtually all the states with Nigerians and listened to their perspectives and their ideas and their aspirations for free, fair, and credible elections. And a lot of that information which we had, we also factored in these preparations. We were able to identify what undermined the credibility of past elections, and we tried to do our best to address these. We tried to creatively and pragmatically introduce new measures and procedures to bring additional transparency and credibility to the electoral process. Specific issues and concerns which we addressed in this process include addressing questions such as how do we prevent multiple voting, snatching and stuffing of ballot boxes, which characterized past elections. How to detect, prevent the use of fake ballot papers. How to detect and prevent fraudulent declaration of false results. How to ensure secure and timely distribution of election materials, as well as secure the voting environment, which used to be also characterized by violence and conflicts. How to bring greater transparency and accountability in the voting and result collation procedures by minimizing the role of INEC staff in collation and the announcement of results. We also introduced a number of new measures which included the following. For example, with regards to the ballot boxes, we added security features and unique serial numbering of the ballot boxes, and we knew which ballot box was taken to which of the 19,976 polling, 19,926 76 polling units. We also produced ballot papers with additional security features, with serial numbering, which was a problem in the past, with color coding of the ballot papers, and we also produced the ballot papers mostly on a constituency by constituency basis, with the number of political parties contesting in each of the constituencies. We did this for all elections except the state constituency elections. We also introduced a new voting procedure, which we called remodified open ballot system. In 1992, when we had an election which until then was considered to be the best organized elections and the freest and the fairest, they used what they call the open ballot system. And the open ballot they used the modified open ballot system. And what we did basically is to take that system and remodify it, introduce additional features, make it a bit more transparent and easier to manage in terms of crowd control. And we used it as a system of voting. Obviously, its major challenge was that it was a bit cumbersome in terms of crowd control. People were required to come and stay for very rigid periods for both accreditation and voting. But certainly in terms of transparency, it was the best thing we could think of under the circumstances. We also introduced a phased and decentralized system of distribution of election materials in order to bring remarkable improvements in terms of early commencement of voting in the polling units. Also, we created, with the cooperation of the security agencies, what we called an interagency consultative committee on election security, which brought together all the security and paramilitary agencies at 3 tiers, at the national level, at the state level, and at the local government levels. And through this, we were able to facilitate greater coordination of roles of security agencies in election management. We were able, through the activities and meetings of this committee, for example, to define the role of each security agency and paramilitary organization in the context of election security, to harmonize roles, to remove duplications of efforts and responsibilities, to create synergy, to minimize inter-service rivalries, and to generally bring greater security and protection into the electoral system. Then we tried to use people of integrity as collation and returning officers rather than using INEC staff who had been perceived to be very corrupt and to have sold votes and results. And we believed that even though a lot of the allegations were based on perceptions, we thought that the best way was to try and insulate INEC staff in these important responsibilities and then bring outsiders that have credibility to be able to do this. And of course, we used the university system effectively and drew from the tertiary institutions. We use senior lecturers and professors, for example, as local government and constituency collation officers and returning officers. And we used vice chancellors and deputy vice chancellors as presidential state collation officers, as well as gubernatorial returning officers. And we also put in mechanisms and facilitated transparent, timely collation and announcement of results with audiovisual recording and live media coverage of these activities. So we did our best, learning from the lessons of the past, to establish procedures, put in measures and mechanisms for a transparent process and to bring additional credibility to the process. And we conducted the elections using these processes and procedures. Accomplishments. Well, some people have said that the jury is still out there in terms of whether the elections, whether there are any substantive or substantial accomplishments. Nonetheless, according to many observers, the following are noteworthy. There is a more credible voters register than what we found in place, and a credible register, comparative, if not better than anyone that we've ever had in the country. We now have an important database with over 73 million registered voters, with photographs, with telephone numbers, with 10 fingerprints for each of these, with addresses, and we believe presently in Nigeria it's probably the largest single national asset as a database in the country. We introduced the modified open ballot system, which I talked about earlier, which brought transparent voting and result announcement procedures at the polling units, which, as I said earlier, was a bit cumbersome, but which was widely received and acknowledged by the voters, and which was appreciated for giving people the opportunity to vote and for their votes in their judgment to count, in spite of the inconveniences that it entailed. We've also recorded remarkably reduced levels of electoral fraud in comparative terms. There is also substantially improved operational and logistical preparations. Obviously, certainly, in many polling units, materials still arrived late. In some places, we had to even make adjustments in terms of the time of commencement of accreditation and voting. But in general, in over 80% of the polling units for all the elections, elections commenced on time. Many observers have also noted that the 2011 elections are freer, more credible, and peaceful elections than ever before in Nigeria's electoral history. This, I think, is specifically in terms of pre-election and election day violence and conflicts. There was, of course, the unfortunate event of post-election violence, which happened after the elections and over the announcement of the results. But in comparative terms, in terms of violence preceding elections and violence on the day of election, we certainly recorded the least in terms of incidences of violence in Nigeria's history. Well, obviously, there are many challenges, and many of these challenges are associated with what I call matters arising from the elections, as well as what needs to be done in terms of consolidating whatever gains have been achieved or attained in the process. The challenges are many and wide-ranging, and they are especially associated with the following. First, associated with addressing causes and consequences of post-election violence. Obviously, it was a very unfortunate thing that has happened. Many lives were lost, property destroyed, particularly in the northern parts of the country. In fact, many of our ad hoc staff, particularly the young men and women of the National Youth Service Corps, who did our country proud, because virtually every team of observers, domestically and internationally, acknowledged the positive contribution of these young men and women in bringing about free, fair, and credible and transparent elections in our country. Unfortunately, they became victims, some of them became victims of this crisis, were targeted in some communities, and at least 9 National Youth Corps members lost their lives in Bauchi state in particular. So obviously one of the major challenges is how to deal with this paradox. While we put in mechanisms and we did our best, and we, in terms of operational and logistics deployments and training of staff and the actual conduct of the elections on election day, still there were unfortunate circumstances of post-election violence which have very serious negative consequences in the body politics. Obviously, a number of causes of this may be related to larger systemic issues rather than the actual conduct of the elections by INEC. Many people have talked about poverty, unemployment, and what I consider to be a crisis of expectations in many fundamental respects. There is a lot of talk. Some analysts have given a lot of pointers to what they perceive to be ethno-religious dimensions also of this. It may be true, but frankly, I see less of it than I see of the larger systemic issues of unemployment, of illiteracy and lack of proper education, both political, public enlightenment and voter education. And of course also what I call the crisis of expectations. There were huge expectations about who wins and who loses, and managing these expectations became a problem, resulting in these unfortunate circumstances. So we have a lot of challenge in this area in terms of addressing these issues, in terms of putting mechanisms in place for peace building, for conflict resolution, and strengthening national integration. Another challenge, I believe, is related to continuous refinement and improvement of the electoral process. We've done our best under the circumstances as an election management body, but we had very little time to do a lot. And obviously there is considerable scope for improvement and further refinements and strengthening the system. A lot of the lessons, and there are many lessons that we've learned from the 2011 elections, will be factored into the future plans in terms of this effort of continuous refinement and improvement of the electoral process. Similarly, we have to pay attention to what I consider some of the matters arising in this process. For example, the complaints that have been accompanying litigation, the complaints made by parties and the accompanying litigation, the strengthening of result transmission and collation procedures, which we identified as a commission as the weaker part of the chain. While we paid a lot of effort and emphasis in ensuring transparency at the ballot, at the polling unit, and we also did quite a lot in terms of securing and ensuring transparency of collation in the collation centers. In between the polling unit and the collation centers, clearly is a weak link, and many of the allegations that are being made may be on account of of this. So there is considerable scope also. It's a big challenge in terms of addressing this and dealing with it. Then also there is an associated challenge of establishing a sustainable continuous voter registration system. The direct capture machines which we purchase and which we use for the registration is to enable us also do continuous sustainable voter registration. Setting up the mechanism for this is quite challenging, but we believe that we have the resources and the capacity to be able to meet that challenge. Then, of course, there is a very, very important challenge of institution building. We have to increase the efficiency and the effectiveness of INEC as an election management body. And we have to do this through reorganization and restructuring, through recruitment of professional cadre of staff, and through training and skills provisioning, and also skill enhancement. There is also the challenge of continuous improvement in the area of utilization of information communications technology in the affairs of the Commission, not just in the management of the database, but also in the general management of the Commission. Use of ICT is generally a challenge in most third-world countries. It's certainly a big challenge in our country, and how we can use it to good effect to bring additional transparency as well as efficiency and effectiveness is something that we have to address beyond the elections. We also have to strengthen the state and local government offices and to continue to insulate our staff in these offices from local political pressures and influences. And a lot of the talk about corruption and inefficiency in the election management body which we inherited is largely attributed to the relationship between local officials and local political officials. So there's a lot that we have to do. It's a big challenge that we have to address post-election. Equally important is how to deal with attitudes and mindsets. And I think if there is any area where I personally think that we could have done a lot, but where we have not done as much as we should have done, it is in the area of voter education, public enlightenment, and the political education. And also in changing mindsets of politicians as well as the ordinary citizens and voters in the political process. The issue of business as usual is something that has to be addressed. The issue of do or die politics, particularly by key political actors, is an issue that has to be addressed and is also associated with mindsets and attitudes. The issue of dealing with electoral offenses and the impunity that characterizes committing electoral offenses is also something that we have to deal with. We've done our best since we came in as a new commission in terms of prosecution of electoral offenders, both during the registration exercise and in the elections. We've recorded quite a number of successful prosecutions, even though relatively small compared with the large number of offenders. And one of the major challenges we had obviously had to do with institutional weaknesses in terms of the legal capacity to handle this prosecution successfully. Preceding the elections, we were able to enter into an agreement with the Nigerian Bar Association, which committed itself to providing legal services to INEC for successful prosecution of these electoral offenses. Unfortunately, it took time before we finalized it, and a lot of the promises we made in terms of prosecuting those who had done multiple registration, we were not able to do before the elections. But now that we have this agreement in place, obviously, one of the major things we'll be doing post-election is the prosecution of electoral offenders in order to deal with that problem of impunity. People committed offenses recklessly with impunity because they believed that they could do it and get away with it. And we established mechanisms of gathering evidence, even using electronic devices during this election. We believe that we have a lot of evidence to be able to successfully prosecute many offenders. Then there is the challenge of driving reforms related to the legal regime. We've successfully been able to engage the National Assembly and the Executive to have amendments to the Electoral Act and the Constitution, which enabled us to do the voter registration and the elections. But there are still quite a number of challenges associated with the legal framework, and we have to continuously engage the legislature and the executive in order to keep on revising the legal framework. For example, while a number of problems were addressed by the amendment to the Electoral Act, in the process of amending the Electoral Act, new contradictions emerged. For example, a provision was somehow smuggled in which undermined the issue of internal party democracy, which made parties believe that regardless of who emerged in the democratic process of party primaries and nomination, that they could just send to INEC any person, and INEC could not but accept it. Because there was an amendment in particular to section 21 of the Electoral Act, which said something to the effect that whichever candidate the party presented to INEC must be accepted and cannot be rejected for any reason whatsoever. Now, in doing that, unfortunately, they forgot that the Electoral Act itself had defined who a candidate is. And so anytime they sent us a list, and some of them were outrageous, somebody who did not even contest in the primaries was now sent to us as a candidate. And we now looked at the provisions of the Electoral Act, and initially we thought we could reject the candidates. But we received legal advice that we also had to be careful, otherwise we would be breaking the laws that we had sworn to uphold. So what we were doing was to now send, when we realized that they were not candidates, we wrote letters back to them and said, well, the people you've sent us from the definition of candidates are not candidates, so please do the needful. And we did that up to the last minute. Some corrected, but many others refused to do so. And unfortunately, and that's a major, I believe, in my view, a moral dilemma for many of us, between compliance with the law and doing what we believed was morally correct. But in the end, having sworn to uphold the law, we had to accept what was given to us so that it would not be said that we had interfered in the internal affairs of the parties and imposed candidates on them. So this is a major issue that we believe has to be addressed post-elections in terms of revisiting some of those provisions of the Electoral Act in order to deal with this issue of internal party democracy, and also what I perceive to be a problem of impunity, because it's reckless abuse of power and of the process. There is also the need also for strengthening the legal regime with regards to improving campaign financing and regulating the use of money in politics. Obviously a lot of this has to do with not only the change of mindsets, but also the political will on the part of the executive and the legislature to drive reforms in this legal regime. I think I've taken quite a lot of time, so in conclusion, I want to say that conducting elections that are free, fair, peaceful, and credible in a country such as Nigeria, given its size, large population, terrain, ethno-religious diversity, is a very difficult assignment even under normal circumstances. Under the far from normal circumstances in which the new INEC had to conduct the 2011 voters registration and the elections, it seemed and sometimes felt like an impossible task. But we believed it was doable, and we did our best in spite of the challenges and the difficulties. And I believe that the overwhelming encouragement, support, and assistance which the Commission received from stakeholders in Nigeria, from friends of Nigeria abroad, and from Nigeria's development partners motivated and inspired us in the Commission to do our best under very difficult circumstances. And I must place on record our appreciation to all of those who have contributed individually and collectively to inspiring us and encouraging us to do what we have to do. We knew that it would be difficult to do a perfect job, and there are certainly many imperfections in the 2011 elections. We are gratified by the general acknowledgement and appreciation of the progress made so far under the circumstances. It was indeed difficult, but it was doable, and we've done our best. It's very interesting in Nigeria, where there is pent-up frustration and also deep-seated cynicism about political reforms. Even some of my friends that I personally consider as cynics are saying, well, okay, you didn't do a credible elections. What you did is an incredible election. And I took it as a compliment. We are greatly inspired to now focus on the remaining matters arising and the challenges requiring greater attention as we pursue electoral reforms more vigorously further into the future. We are now more determined and better prepared to keep on making substantive improvements for the satisfaction of the aspirations of Nigerians for free, fair, peaceful, and credible elections. Thank you very much.